Hey, hi, hello there, and welcome back to Formula Amateur. Today we are talking about a brief history of the Scuderia Ferrari. We are going to go through every single driver of every single year of the iconic team that has been there since the very beginning. And let's get into it because there is a lot, especially in the early days. So let's get into it. So we start in the 1950s, in 1950 specifically, where Enzo Ferrari decided that he wants his famous brand of cars to get onto the grid of this fascinating new sport called Formula One. And in the first year, during the first 2 years of the sport, the team principal was Federico Ghiberti. So he was team principal for 1950 and 1951. And in 1950, his drivers were Alberto Ascari, Dorino Serafini, Raymond Sommer, and Luigi Villorossi. And in 1951, it was Alberto Ascari, Jose Frolian Gonzalez, Piero Taruffi, and Luigi Villoresi again. Then, from 52 to 53, the team principal was Nello Ugolini, and in this case, in 1952, the drivers were Alberto Ascari, Giuseppe Farina, Andre Simone, Piero Taruffi, Luigi Villoresi. And in 1953, it was Alberto Ascari, Piero Carini, Giuseppe Farina, Mike Hawthorne, Umberto Maglioli, Luigi Villoresi. Then in 1954 we had Alberto Ascari, Giuseppe Farina, Jose Frolian Gonzalez, Mike Hawthorne, Umberto Maglioli, Robert Manzon, Maurice Trintignant, and Piero Taruffi. Once again, I would like to apologise for all of my terrible pronunciations of all of these names. In 1955 we had Eugenio Castellotti, Giuseppe Farina, Paul Ferrere, Olivia Gendabine, Jose Frolian Gonzalez, Mike Hawthorne, Umberto Maglioli, Harry Schell, Piero Taruffi, and Maurice Trintignant. And then in 1956, the team principal was Eraldo Scuati, and he was only there for 1 year. And the drivers were Eugenio Castellotti, Peter Collins, Juan Manuel Fangio, Paul Ferreira, Olivia Gendabine, Luigi Musso, Andre Pellet, Alfonso de Portogo, and Wolfgang von Trips. And then in 1957, once again, a 1-year team principal in Mino Amorotti, and the drivers were once again Eugenio Castellotti. Then we had Peter Collins, Jose Frolian Gonzalez, Luigi Musso, Mike Hawthorne, Cesar Paradisa, Alfonso de Portago, Maurice Trintignant, and Wolfgang von Trips. And then in 1958 to 1961, the team principal was Romolo Tavini, and in 1958 the drivers were Peter Collins, Olivia Gendabine, Mike Hawthorne, Luigi Musso, Wolfgang von Trips, and Phil Hill. In 1959 it was Cliff Allison, Jean Bechra, Tony Brooks, Olivia Gendabine, Dan Gurney, Phil Hill, and Wolfgang von Trips. And now we move on to the 1960s, and in 1960 the drivers were Cliff Allison, Richie Ginther, Jose Frolian Gonzalez, Phil Hill, Willie Mariès, and Wolfgang von Trips. In 1961 it was Olivier Gendabine, Richie Ginther, Phil Hill, Willie Mariès, Ricardo Rodriguez, and Wolfgang von Trips. And then we had another change of team principal. This time it was Eugenio Dragoni from 1962 to 1966. And in 1962 the drivers were Giancarlo Baghetti, Lorenzo Bandini, Phil Hill, Willie Mariesi, Ricardo Rodriguez. In 1963 it was Lorenzo Bandini, Willie Mariès, Ludovico Scarafiotti, and John Surtees. In 1964 it was Lorenzo Bandini, Pedro Rodriguez, Ludovico Scarfiotti and John Surtees. And in 1965 it was Lorenzo Bandini, Bob Bondurant, Pedro Rodriguez, Ludovico Scarfiotti, John Surtees and Nino Vaccarella. And then in 1966 it was Lorenzo Bandini, Mike Parks, Ludovico Scarfiotti, John Surtees. And then in 1967 we had yet another team principal change. This one was only in 1967, Franco Lini, and the drivers in 1967 were Chris Amon, Lorenzo Bandini, Mike Parks, Ludovico Scarfiotti and Jonathan Williams. And then in 1968 till 1970 the team principal was Franco Gozzi. And in 1968 the drivers were Chris Amon, Derek Bell, Andrea Adamovich, Jackie Ickx. And then in 1969 it was Chris Amon, Ernesto Brambilla and Pedro Rodriguez. And then we go into the 70s, so let's get in. So now as we hit the 1970s, we're seeing a fewer driver changes throughout the years, but still a crazy lot of team principals in and out. So to close out Franco Gozzi's career as a Ferrari team principal, in 1970 it was Ignazio Giunti, Jackie Ickx and Clay Rigazzoni. And then the team principal was Peter Scetti from 1971 to 1972, and in 1971 the drivers were Mario Andretti, Jackie Ickx and Clay Rigazzoni. And then in 1972 it was Mario Andretti, Nanni Galli, Arturo Merzario, Jackie Ickx and Clay Rigazzoni. And then in 1973 we had once again a one-year team principal in Alessandro Colombo, and in 1973 the drivers were Jackie Ickx and Arturo Merzario. And then in 1974 to 1975 the team principal was Luca Cordero di Montezemelo, and the drivers in 1974 were Niki Lauda and Clay Rigazzoni, and the same in 1975. And then the team principal was Daniele Audetto, and he was once again a one-year deal in terms of team principals. And in 1976 the drivers were Niki Lauda, Clay Rigazzoni and Carlos Reutemann. And then we had another one-year team principal in Roberto Nozzetto, and the drivers were Niki Lauda and Gilles Villeneuve and Carlos Reutemann in 1977. And then the next team principal was Marco Piccini, who was one of the longer lasting team principals. He was team principal from 1978 to 1988. So in 1988 the drivers were Carlos Reutemann and Gilles Villeneuve, and in 1979 it was Jody Scheckter and Gilles Villeneuve. And then we go into the 80s, baby. So now we head to the 80s, where the drivers were in 1980 specifically Jody Scheckter and Gilles Villeneuve, and then in 1981 it was Didier Pironi and Gilles Villeneuve. In 82 it was Mario Andretti, Didier Pironi, Patrick Tambay and Gilles Villeneuve. In 83 it was René Arnoux and Patrick Tambay. In 84 it was Michele Alboreto and René Arnoux. In 85 it was Michele Alboreto, René Arnoux and Stefan Johansson. In 86 it was Michele Alboreto and Stefan Johansson. And then in 87 it was Michele Alboreto and Gerhard Berger. In 88 it was Michele Alboreto and Gerhard Berger again. And then in 1989 the team principal changed once again, this time to Cesar Florio, and he was there from 1989 to 1991. And in 1989, the final year to close out the 80s, the drivers were Gerhard Berger and Nigel Mansell. And now we get on to the 90s. And now we're in the 90s, and in 1990 the drivers were Nigel Mansell and Alain Prost, and in 1991 it was Jean Alesi, Alain Prost, Gianni Morbidelli, and also briefly the team principal was Claudio Lombardi to close out the season. And then in 1992 to 1993 the team principal was Sante Gadini. And in 1992 the drivers were Jean Alesi, Ivan Capelli and Nicola Larini. And in 1993 it was Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger. This is also to close out the year Jean Todt took over, and he was there from 1993 to 2007 as team principal. And in 1994, the drivers were Jean Alesi, Nicola Larini and Gerhard Berger. In 1995, it was Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger. In 1996, it was Eddie Irvine and Michael Schumacher. This carried on in 1997, 1998, and in 1999 with the addition of Mika Salo. And then in 2000, it was another set of Michael Schumacher years. So let's move on to the 2000s. So the 2000s were a year of repetitions in a way. We had started off the decade with Rubens Barrichello and Michael Schumacher. In 2001, also Rubens Barrichello and Michael Schumacher. Then in 2002, Rubens Barrichello and Michael Schumacher. And then in 2003, Rubens Barrichello and Michael Schumacher. In 2004, Rubens Barrichello and Michael Schumacher. And then in 2005, we had Felipe Massa and Michael Schumacher. And then in 2006, we had Felipe Massa and Michael Schumacher again, but this was the last year before Michael Schumacher retired for the first time. And then in 2006, we had Felipe Massa and Kimi. In 2007, actually, it was Felipe Massa and Kimi Räikkönen. And then Stefano Domenicali, who is now the top dog in Formula 1, took over Ferrari in 2008 and was the team principal until 2014. And in 2008, the drivers were Felipe Massa and Kimi Räikkönen. And to close out the decade in 2009, it was Felipe Massa, Kimi Räikkönen, Luca Badua and Giancarlo Fisichella. So now let's move on to the 2010s. So heading into the 2010s now, where in 2010 the drivers were Fernando Alonso and Felipe Massa. In 2012 it was Fernando Alonso and Felipe Massa again. In 2013 also Fernando Alonso and Felipe Massa. And then in 2014 it was Fernando Alonso, Kimi Räikkönen, and once Domenicali left, Marco Mattiacci stepped in but finished his team principal career in Ferrari that same year. And then Maurizio Arrivabene became team principal from 2015 to 2018, and at that time in 2015 the drivers were Kimi Räikkönen and Sebastian Vettel, and in 2016 it was Kimi Räikkönen and Sebastian Vettel as well. In 2017 Kimi Räikkönen and Sebastian Vettel, and in 2018 Kimi Räikkönen and Sebastian Vettel. I think that perhaps there was a soft spot for those two in his heart. And then the team principal in 2019 to 2022 was Mattia Binotto, who is currently in Sauber / the Audi project. So to close out the 2010s, the drivers were Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel in 2019. So now we enter the current decade, the 2020s, and in 2020 the drivers were Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel for the final time before Sebastian Vettel went to Aston Martin. And then in 2021 it was Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, and in 2022 once again Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. And then the team principal in 2023 became Frederic Vasseur, who came in from Sauber / Alfa Romeo, and he has been the team principal ever since then. And in 2023 the drivers were Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. In 2024 ditto Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. And then we enter 2025 where the drivers are Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. So the Ferrari team is the oldest team on the grid, known as Scuderia Ferrari, currently Scuderia Ferrari HP, or the HP Scuderia Ferrari, whichever one they prefer. They're the only team who have been in the sport for the entire 75 years of the sport's existence, and to this date they have 16 constructors titles and 15 drivers titles, and the team was founded by the Enzo Ferrari himself. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of A Brief History of on Formula Amateur. Please check out my lovely colleagues on the Be The Change Media Network. Check out our website, BeTheChangeMediaNetwork.com. We will have a new episode on Monday where we will be discussing the results in yet another race rundown with the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, so keep a lookout for that one. I hope you have a lovely rest of your weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Bye.